Good morning. My name is Brian Fassett. I'm one of your worship associates. Today, we're going to learn more about Olympia Brown, an amazing woman who spent her life fighting for important causes and for other people. When I think about determination, fighting for important causes, taking the long view, about perseverance, about doing the right thing, and being a strong woman, I am lucky to have many examples in my life. But the top of my list is my wife. And I have pretty high standards. I come from a long line of strong women. Both of my grandmothers were amazing people. To this day, I hold them as examples in my mind as people I try to emulate. My mom's mom helped foster my love of travel. I can still hear her say, "I'd rather be sorry for something I did than something I didn't do." She was the mother of 9. She was college educated, an occupational therapist, and an accomplished ceramics and watercolor artist. She stuck with my grandfather through World War II, the trauma that he dealt with for the rest of his life, the ups and downs of him running his own business, and did I mention 9 kids? She inspired my love of leathercraft after giving me the tools that she made during the war. About the same time that I decided to study abroad my first time, my grandmother decided to take a trip too. She went with a group of college students 55 years younger than her to visit France and learn French. She was an amazing woman. Hard work, smart, kind, talented, an amazing cook. My dad's mom was equally admirable. She spent her life on a ranch. She grew and processed the vast majority of the food that her and our family ate, including fruits, vegetables, chicken, beef. She processed it all. She could cook or can or bake anything. She made the world's best sourdough bread, and angel food cake, and lemon meringue pie. She was an accomplished seamstress as well, making wedding dresses, among other things, and she was a skilled barber and hairdresser who fixed many of our home haircuts. She hand-washed her dishes and her clothes all of her life. She also had a huge rose garden. She supported my grandfather through a lifetime of ups and downs in a fickle cattle market, unpredictable weather, and other challenges. She cared for him at home through a stroke and skin cancer that ended his life. I have never met somebody who was more positive or kind. Growing up, my mom was tough. When I was in elementary school, she made the hard decision to end her marriage and to go back to college to finish her degree. With 3 young children, she decided to forego her dream of being a pharmacist and opted to become a teacher so that she would have more time with us. In the meantime, we lived on food stamps. Our names were on the community Christmas tree, while she worked 2 jobs and went to school full-time. She was a night security guard at the local hospital, even though she's only 5 foot 2 inches tall and 100 pounds. She took me with her to her college classes the summer that I broke my arm. We lived in student housing, in a mobile home, in shared rentals until she finished that degree. She had a dream, and she saw it through. She went on to teach middle school and high school and community college science for more than 20 years. So, like I said, I have high standards when it comes to strong, determined women. Many of you know my wife, but you may not know just how much tenacity she has. If you want to get something done, just tell Kate she can't do it. That's all it takes. I promise you, she will prove you wrong. Everything she does, she gives 100%, unless someone tells her no, and then she steps it up and gives 150%. She never gives up, and we are all the better for it. Maybe that's because she's faced more than her fair share of challenges. She's managed a chronic disease every day of her life for the last 3.5 decades. Every time she eats or exercises or gets sick, she has to manage this. And she employs that same level of perseverance and determination and care with everything else she does and every relationship that she maintains. I don't know anyone who spends more time thinking of other people than Kate. She spent a year just to get approved so we could serve in the Peace Corps, and that was so we could be volunteers. When she wanted to become a mother, she was advised against it, but she did what it took, and now we have 2 amazing daughters. When we wanted to live overseas again, Kate made that happen too. When the pandemic changed everyone's lives, Kate upended her career and created an amazing homeschooling experience for our girls, including regularly helping them protest in support of Black Lives Matter. Kate always steps up to the challenge. She does the right thing and takes care of the people around her along the way. So here's to Kate and all the courageous women who make the world a better place.
I don't know about all of you, but sometimes, especially here lately, I feel really overwhelmed by the state of the world. It's easy to become frozen with indecision. There's so many issues to care about, and each one of them on their own, much less taken together, is urgent and seems insurmountable. Like Frodo, I feel willing to carry the ring, but worry that I don't know the way or even where to start. I think that it can be helpful to remember that we are not alone in this struggle toward a beloved community. Not only are there countless people around the world struggling to birth a more just world at the same time, in ways both big and small, but we are not alone in history either. Our ancestors are with us in this struggle, and our children and their children and their children are with us in this struggle. Olympia Brown was born in 1835 in Michigan. Her parents, who were farmers and lifelong Universalists, wanted their daughters to be educated. They had 4 of them. Educating daughters was not something that was a given, but the Browns were so dedicated to this idea that Asa, her father, built a schoolhouse himself on their family farm. And then, with little Olympia in tow, he went from door to door, which, if you're from farm country, you know is no small feat, raising funds to hire a teacher and drumming up enrollment for the school. I get the impression nobody told Asa Brown no either. So it is perhaps not surprising that Olympia Brown wanted to go to college, which not many women did at the time. Initially, she went to Mount Holyoke. It was then Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in Massachusetts, which had been educating women for more than 20 years at that point. It seemed an obvious choice, and she convinced her parents to let her apply. She was admitted and sent and headed back east. But young ladies are not allowed to stand in the doorway. Young ladies are not allowed to linger in the hall. We never examine young ladies in algebra. She left after 1 year, claiming that it was too rigidly Calvinistic. That must have been such a disappointment. She had looked forward to it so much, and she had worked so hard to convince her parents to let her go all that distance. But she then enrolled in Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Horace Mann, the great education reformer and a Unitarian, was president of the newly formed college, and it was advertised as a great experiment in coeducation for men and women. This is not to say that there were no difficulties or controversies while she was there. Olympia was frustrated by the many rigid rules that were in place to ensure the rigorous moral standards of the day. But nonetheless, she had such good things to say about her experience there that she convinced her parents to relocate to Ohio so that all of her younger sisters could be educated there as well. She must have been really persuasive. Can you imagine packing up all your belongings and selling the family farm because your college kids said, "Hey, you'll love it here"? In her last year of college, Olympia invited the Reverend Antoinette Blackwell Brown, no relation, to speak at Antioch, and it was a game changer for Olympia. She wrote later, "It was the first time I had heard a woman preach, and a sense of victory lifted me up. I felt as though the kingdom of heaven were at hand." So, she set her sights on divinity school next. Meadville Theological School in Pennsylvania, a Unitarian seminary, turned her down flat. They scoffed at the idea of a female minister, which is pretty amusing since that's my seminary. It's Marcia's alma mater too, but they weren't as open-minded in 1860. Oberlin College granted Olympia admittance, but with the understanding that she would not be allowed to speak, only to attend and listen to the lectures. Oberlin had many female students at the time, actually more than 1/3 of the student body, but their philosophy was very much that their female students were there to be trained to serve as discreet, genteel, pious, and frugal wives for ministers. Finally, Brown was admitted to the Universalist Theological School at St. Lawrence University. It was brand new. Along with her acceptance, though, she received a letter from Ebenezer Fisher, the president of the school. Mr. Fisher wrote to her that while he personally did not think that women had any business in the ministry, he would leave that between her and the great head of the church. Olympia Brown agreed that God was and should be the final say on that, and so she packed her bags and showed up in the fall. And apparently, Fisher was very surprised when she got there because he said that he had been sure his letter would dissuade her, but not Olympia. She was made of sterner stuff. So the only place that said yes to her also said point blank to her face that they really didn't want her there. That must have been really, really frustrating. Throughout her time there, she was mocked and hazed by her classmates. In particular, they would make fun of her sermons in falsetto voices outside her room at night, outside her windows. And on top of that, she had an uphill battle to convince the faculty to award her a degree at all. She must have been so angry. I'm angry just listening to it. But she graduated from St. Lawrence in 1863. She was the first woman to do so. And later that year, she was ordained as a Universalist minister, which was another campaign that she had to wage to convince a group of men to approve her. And in this case, that was a group of Universalists. But she persisted, and she prevailed, making her the first woman to achieve full ministerial standing recognized by a denomination. Now, if you're wondering about the Reverend Antoinette Brown that I mentioned earlier, the difference is that Reverend Antoinette was ordained by a single congregation that wasn't recognized by the greater denomination or other congregations. So, Olympia was called to be the minister of a struggling Universalist congregation in Weymouth Landing, Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, Brown came to know several prominent women's rights activists, such as Lucy Stone, who was mentioned in our reading earlier, and Susan B. Anthony. She became active in the women's suffrage movement, and in 1867 she took a 4-month leave of absence from her church to travel to Kansas to give speeches in support of women's suffrage. There was a ballot measure there that was coming up for a vote. And although she had been assured ahead of time that plans had been made in advance for her to go there and speak, she arrived in Kansas to find that very little had actually been done. She would have to make her own travel arrangements between towns, and mind you, this is the 1860s. Nowhere in the readings did it mention that there was a war on, but that can't have helped. And she had to secure halls in which to speak. She had to advertise her speeches herself. She had to find lodgings in each town. She had to face down hostile townspeople who wanted to discredit her. She must have felt so beleaguered and alone. Even the weather didn't cooperate. It was a blazing heat wave, apparently. But she persisted. She gave more than 300 speeches in a 4-month span. That's several speeches a day. In the end, only 1/3 of the votes were in favor of women's suffrage. And some would see that as a failure for all that effort. But you know what? She saw that as a major victory. She convinced 30% of those men to vote for women's suffrage. It was an improvement. She went back east, well pleased with her efforts and determined to continue her work for women's rights. A few years later, Olympia found herself in need of new employment, and she wrote to a Universalist church in Racine, Wisconsin, which she had heard was without a minister. And Mr. Fish and Fisher, I know it's weird, wrote back saying that the parish had been run down by, quote, a series of pastors that were easygoing, unpractical, and some even spiritually unworthy, and they had left the church adrift, in debt, hopeless, and doubtful whether any pastor could again rouse them. Well, that must have been discouraging. But you know what? She took that job. And in her autobiography, she said that some people would be surprised by the kinds of congregations that she served, but that was all there was for a woman. All of the prosperous congregations already had men in the pulpits and young men coming out of seminary that were angling for them. And so she tended to take the fixer-uppers. And she said she was glad to do so. And she really did turn that little church around. It's now called the Olympia Brown Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. She liked to push her comfort zone. She took difficult jobs, and then at age 53, when she was in full stride as a minister, she decided to give up being a minister and instead devote herself full-time to the cause of women's suffrage. She focused on suffrage and on women's education. And despite working tirelessly, by the late 1800s, the 1890s, it seemed like the fire had gone out of the movement. Things languished there for a bit. By that time, she had spent more than 30 years working for women's rights, and I wonder, did she ever feel overwhelmed? Did she think that she couldn't see the way forward anymore? What an amazing capacity to tolerate frustration she must have had, because she just kept pulling up those weeds and sprinkling the ground with water. Movement got a new infusion of energy just a few years later from the likes of Alice Paul and Lucy Barnes. Their women's party in the early 1900s was rowdier than the previous generation had been. They were more confrontational, and they took the message out of the lecture halls and into the streets, where they were often met with violence, with harassment from both organized men and the policemen who should have protected them. And despite being in her 70s and 80s at that time, Olympia Brown was in the streets with them. She said, "I was born to belong to this party." She stood in front of the White House and burned Woodrow Wilson's speeches, denouncing him for failing to back the suffrage Amendment. On November 2nd, 1920, Olympia Brown cast her vote in the first American election to allow women voters. Having seen the goal that she had worked for decades finally come to pass, she promptly began working for world peace as a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She was 85 years old, still stretching her comfort zone. And this feels like such a beautiful ending to this story. It's so satisfying that she got to see that day. But most of the women that she had fought beside to achieve that day didn't live to see it, and was their journey and their contribution any less satisfying? And of course, we know that that was not the end of the story of fighting for women's rights. It was just the end of the story of Olympia Brown's part in fighting for women's rights. On August 26, 1920, 26 million adult women were made eligible to vote for the first time in a national election in America. But on that November day, a couple months later, when Olympia cast her vote, only about 7 million of them did. There was widespread voter suppression. The suppression networks that existed already to target Black men was weaponized against all women, and of course, especially against women of color. The same kinds of strategies that we are seeing today to intimidate voters in districts with high concentrations of people of color or poor persons were used then. And the right to vote, well, it's a threshold right, it's a toehold. The whole point is that theoretically, with the right to vote, you can influence other unjust policies. Policies around education and property rights, or policies around consent and bodily autonomy, policies around equal pay. But those milestones came much, much later, and some of them we are still working for, and certainly not everyone enjoys them. But without Reverend Olympia Brown and her fellow organizers, we wouldn't be where we are today. On the centennial of Brown's ordination, a plaque was dedicated to her in her honor at St. Lawrence University, where she had been so hazed, which reads, in part, "Forerunner of the new era, the flame of her spirit still burns today." That flame is a torch that she has passed to us, her spiritual descendants, and which we will one day pass on to the next generation. And I find this long view of the work of social justice to be oddly comforting, because it means that we don't have to solve it all right now. We certainly don't have to do it alone. We just have to find that flame in our own spirit, pick a good cause that we're fired up by, and go do our part to carry that torch to the next person. And when we experience frustration and failure or obstruction, we need to remember that we are part of a very fine historical tradition. I pray that it be so. Amen.